Time in 4 months, ladies and gentlemen, we are back. This is Logos Media's UnSpun, episode number 205, season 14, episode 1. We only had 2 shows for all of last year. Thank goodness it was a nice break. Hopefully it is streaming. Yes, it is, so that is good. And we've had quite an eventful several months since the last show. I know we said we were going to do a show for the 13th anniversary and did not. I ended up having to move and then wanted to start doing shows with Steve a few weeks ago, and then had a tree hit the house. You can see that big branch sticking through the ceiling. The tree is removed off of the house finally. It cost me $3,600 to get the tree cut down, but yikes. But the roof, ceiling, walls, carpet, floors, insulation all still have to be replaced. They couldn't get that branch out. And so the roofers, when they tear the roof off, they'll pull that roof out and then create a big hole in here and cause all of the drywall to fall down into my studio here. And then so move, tree, and then the main highway up and down the mountain washed out a couple weeks ago and caused havoc, and got an extra hour travel time going down the mountain and back, at least 30 minutes each way, no traffic. Steve, welcome back.
Hi.
Kieran has actually decided to join us tonight. Kieran, welcome back.
Thank you. Hello, everybody.
And so we are going to be discussing normalizing schizophrenia. We'll probably start all the way back, as far back as we can historically go, and maybe Plato, Socrates back, and just kind of work forward probably into some MK Ultra type stuff, and just show the whole progression and normalization of schizophrenia. Oh yeah, I have for those of you who want to see, this was like an 80 to 90 foot cedar tree that hit my house. The thing was absolutely ginormous. So, yeah, that was a big, big dang tree. And, thank God, whatever you want to say, about 4 or 5 seconds before the tree fell on the house, I'm not kidding, I see one of my trash cans blow down the street. So I run down and go out the door, and I get to the bottom of the driveway, and I hear boom behind me. So like I'm out of the house for 4 or 5 seconds before the tree hit the house. You guys still there?
It's a divine providence.
Yep.
Yeah, something, I mean, I'm glad.
You've kind of been through it. You've been through kind of a mess lately.
Yeah.
Well, the tree fell from the neighbor's yard, which was 20 foot plus over the fence, 20 foot on this side of the fence, lands on the house, the top snaps off, and lands at the wall clear on the other side of the house. So we're talking a big tree. So...
yeah, that branch doesn't do it justice. When you see the actual whole tree, that branch does not. It was a huge tree.
A couple weeks ago, I wouldn't even come in here, but I've been dealing with insurance companies trying to deny claims and blah, blah, blah. But I wouldn't have even been in here a couple of weeks ago because the tree was about 3 tons. So, they're going to have to replace this wall, the ceiling, the roof, everything, so I mean I had trash cans and buckets all over the room in here because it was streaming water in, and just a lovely good time. So Steve.
Yes.
Schizophrenia.
Well, I think you and I can talk. We haven't given up talking over this kind of respite that we've had, but we kind of came a kind of mutual epiphanies about the same time about schizophrenia.
And just to interject, as did Hans, because I spoke to him a couple weeks ago about doing a show soon. And he's like, "Oh my goodness, I'm researching the normalization of schizophrenia as well."
Right. So you're basically, you've asked me to do this one, but there's also one down the road a little bit that we're going to do again, that a little bit different. But what I'd like to do is kind of reconstruct our thought process. So what I need to do first is I need to talk about optics, because my little bit of my epiphany had to do with the optical theory. And what we're kind of used in Christianity and Western history and stuff, we're constantly thinking in terms of the Roman Empire and how the civilization spread to the West. And we constantly forget about that Christianity, actually, the greater part of Christianity probably moved to the East. And the center of education, of higher thought in Christianity was not in the Roman Empire. In fact, it purposely tried to stay clear of the Roman Empire in cities like Edessa and Nisibis. The Church of the East eventually had its impact on the West, and that's what started the Renaissance. But in modern physics, there's thoughts about what is light and what is matter. If you look at the Church of the East, they had kind of a different view of the beginning of Genesis, and the beginning God created the earth and let there be light and things like that. Whereas we in the West, we sort of hear it as let there be light as knowledge. They didn't just hear it that way. They heard light being a physical property that actually aided and somehow functioned within creation itself. And so you look at modern physics concepts. One of them is light. I read this in Scientific America decades ago, that one way of thinking about light was photons existing simultaneously along its entire path. And then in regards to matter, some physicists look at matter as really being frozen light. But a lot of that stuff gets forgotten these days and kind of runs up against Einstein, where you have speed limits of light and things like that. And so what I'd like to do here is start off with a little optical experiment that most people don't really know about, but you can do it really in your garage with a minimal amount of parts. I'm wearing a white shirt tonight just specifically for that. And what I do is I have some polarized lenses. In light, the theory is that light has a north-south polarity and east-west polarity. And so I've got two lenses here. One's north-south and one's east and west. And I've got another one here, the same thing. And when you put them on top of each other, you can see when one's blocking out the north-south and one's blocking out the east-west, because when both polarities are blocked out, you get black. And so if I switch it around this way, it's kind of hard to see, but one locks out the other, right? Okay. This little experiment we're doing here has puzzled physicists. There's still no answer for this. So now I've got a third lens here, okay? And the third lens, if I put it in front, there's no effect.
You want to just hold it up a little bit higher?
Okay.
There you go.
You see that?
Yeah.
Okay, so now if I put the lens in front, there's no effect and no lens. But if I slide this lens in a 45-degree angle in between, it starts opening it back up again. I don't know if you can see that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And as you go around, it opens and shuts.
Yeah.
Now, the thing is, there's no real physical explanation why that works. And the thing is also, one of the things that they've determined is, even though the speed of light has a constant, supposedly a constant, which it really isn't entirely, that little informational difference is an instantaneous thing. It's been theorized that actually travels entirely down the path. If that light beam went, 1,000 light years, 1,000,000 light years out, all that would happen instantaneously. There's several lectures on Google, you can look them up, where there's no real explanation why light should have a speed limit, but this type of informational thing with light should be instantaneous entirely along its path. Okay, Now, the thing that's prodded me on this is that when you start looking at the Church of the East and what they believe light to be, and when that migrated into the West after, at the start of the Renaissance, these scholars, these Christian scholars, were really working underneath the umbrella of Islam. The history books usually teach that Islam was the one that discovered these properties, not this one particularly, but these somewhat advanced properties of light. But it really was Christians working underneath them that discovered them. And then when they fled Islam for the West, they brought them with it. And that's what brought modern science when East literally met West. And so what the problem is that here you have, especially in the Renaissance and going all the way back even to the beginning of the church, you see what's evolving is a very sophisticated version of what light is. Another version of this story is Isaac Newton. When he started doing his color theories and things like that, it wasn't much later than Wolfgang Goethe looked at these theories. There's something missing from these things. And you can look this up. If you go on the YouTube, look up Wolfgang Goethe's color theory, that Goethe found out that Newton was lax in what he was actually trying to prove. He proved what he could prove, but neglected to prove what he couldn't prove, if that makes sense. He left one whole aspect of modern optics out. When he went back and physicists look back, the older color theory is now being re-looked at again, even today, as Goethe had looked at it and said, our color theory is only explaining half of what optics really is. So as all these different optical theories came through, they were very much wedded to an advanced look at Genesis, not just light in terms of knowledge, but light and physical light as being the generation, God's way of generating the entire universe. Now, the thing that prodded me with schizophrenia and stuff like that, and I want to turn it back to Jan after this because we're going to go into the CIA and things, is that you look back, and this is something that's taught in physics class and high school classes, that Plato had this idea that reality was a projection of the mind.
Primacy of consciousness.
Right. So why, if in the East particularly, you had all these advanced concepts of optics, what is Plato doing with this seemingly primitive version of optics? And that's the thing that's been a puzzle of mine for decades.
Well, and you and I had discussed some months back about how the denial of reality is the greatest sin.
Yeah.
And, and it's, it's like we can have gluttony and the seven deadly sins, but really, if you deny reality, all else follows, which is what people like Aldous Huxley and Alan Watts and Terence McKenna and Leary and all of these people promoted, that reality wasn't real. In fact, just really quickly, Steve, I have a quote here from Aldous Huxley's Heaven and Hell, and he talks about many schizophrenics have their times of heavenly happiness, but the fact that, unlike the mescaline taker, they do not know when, if ever, they will be permitted to return to the reassuring banality of everyday experience causes even heaven to seem appalling. And in Heaven and Hell, Aldous and in the Brave New World, they're constantly comparing to the psychedelic experience to schizophrenia. Here's another quote from him. The schizophrenic is a soul not merely unregenerate, but desperately sick into the bargain. His sickness consists of the inability to take refuge from the inner and outer reality, as the sane person has habitually done. In the homemade universe of common sense, the strictly human world of useful notions, shared symbols, and socially acceptable conventions, the schizophrenic is like a man permanently under the influence of mescaline. And so, and then, of course, as I've exposed and 200 plus shows. Aldous Huxley was the key architect behind MK Ultra. But, originally psychedelics were called psychotomimetics, so that was like the second or third name that they created for them within a few months' time, which means to mimic psychosis. And then they went away from that word to sell them as psychedelics to generate to generate the mind. And then they went on to entheogens to generate God within. Mm-hmm. And so they went through this whole progression of taking what they knew was essentially a psychotic or schizophrenic experience and then remarketing that, as I exposed in my article, Entheogens, What's in a Name, remarketing that schizophrenia as a spiritual experience.
Going back to the church, one of the things that happened, and you barely read about it in classes and things like this, but you can look it up again. You can look it up in Wikipedia even. At the beginning of the Renaissance in the 1200s, they were still, the world essentially ran on Aristotle, but there was always Plato in the background. The big argument at that point was, as science was starting to creep into the West and these advanced optical theories were creeping to the West, along with it came with who's the real Plato and who's the real Aristotle. And so you find if the Bishop of Paris actually had all this documents of very early Western science, it was very advanced. It didn't have all the mathematics, but actually between people of Robert Grosseteste and Roger Bacon and things like that, you actually find quite advanced theories, especially in optics. But the real problem was, if you look it up, there was 2 condemnations by the church, one in 1210 and one in 1277, trying to figure out who was the authentic Christian philosophy, Plato or Aristotle. And what had happened is the whole well of knowledge got polluted by a Muslim named Averroes. And his whole thing was this primacy of consciousness, what they called monopsychism. And even more heretical than whether Plato or Aristotle was which one distanced the church farthest from this monopsychism. And the problem was, as Averroes picked up from Islam, this idea that they had an Aristotelian version of monopsychism, which wasn't known to the West. And so it created this tremendous discussion and this controversy. And eventually it was a confusion as who were they going to condemn and who was the side that actually represented this monopsychism the best. And that was the one they were going to condemn. Unfortunately, they didn't have all the information. So initially they condemned Aristotle. Over the time, it gave legitimacy to Plato, which, as everybody knows, Plato nowadays is advocated by the occult and Hermeticism and things like that. We're still in this quagmire of the condemnation of 1277 when this stuff was declared heretical.
And you actually came across my work, Steve, originally because of shows that I had done over a decade ago with David Harriman on his debunking of quantum physics, and they're trying to show that, reality isn't real, this primacy of consciousness, that the world is a reflection of our minds rather than us being a part of the world or reality. And he went in debunking Immanuel Kant and these guys, showing how they had based the foundation of all of this on Kant and on poor philosophy. And we can probably take Kant back to Plato and Plato's schizophrenia and kind of come all the way forward. Would you agree with that?
What really shocked me more than even that, I would say, is recently when I started looking at the CIA in the 50s and 60s, the church, especially the people of an Orthodox persuasion, looked at, when you looked at modern art, you saw people throwing paint on the wall and calling it art. You saw people taking poetry and just putting nonsense words together and things like that. But what it wasn't just, I don't know how to explain it. It was partially that, but somehow this whole thing gelled. And I think it gelled for you about the same time, in that you started, the church and people who were looking at this, critics of modernism, which this is what this is all called, would look at this and they'd say, well, this is a psychological, not so much a psychological problem, but just a philosophy adopted in postmodernism and modernism, that this was an evolution of art. This was a natural progression of the way music and painting and things work. But then
by devolution.
Yeah, but the thing is as you know, and there's the research I've been doing recently, and there's some fairly decent books on it, is that this was foisted on us by the CIA. That what happened is that during World War II, there was an argument as to which was going to take over the world system, capitalism and socialism, or communism, Marxism. And there was a worry that Marxism was attracting all the elite in Europe, and that provided more freedom. And so the CIA came up with this idea that the main way we were going to fight against this kind of totalitarianism was to prove that we were more free than they were, and that we would tolerate all sorts of, that we literally would be tolerant of what at the time would be considered degeneracy.
Which you and I had discussed on the show, the behavioral sync episode, and
well, E. Michael Jones too, that he had several books initially before he got into his religious books, wrote books like Degenerate Moderns and stuff, but they were always from the approach that the world was evolving into this degenerate fashion, and nobody had considered that this was foisted on us through propaganda.
Right. Well, and Orfeo in the chat just promoted, or just popped up Frankfurt. Yeah, the Frankfurt School, the Fabian socialists, which are tied directly with them, were a part of this whole agenda of promoting degeneracy as normalcy. And now, go ahead.
Well, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, different modern art, they literally took the artists that were commercial artists before World War II, who were drawing, Uncle Sam posters, and started funding them to create degenerate art. Then they would have art fairs and art shows where they would award these people millions of dollars to create a false sense of progress in modernism.
Right.
You can imagine if you're a woman, say, going to art school and you're studying and studying and studying, and you're a pretty good artist, but all of a sudden your work is worthless because all the people are getting the attention are artists. Honestly, it's kind of a game theory thing. People take the path of least resistance. And so what happens is the thing that gets the most support gets supported.
Right.
You as an artist, you think you're wrong, but yeah.
Well, and they get rid of classical arts and painting and music, and then they bring in, a few, and what, 8, 9, 10 years ago, I did a show with Gavin Kearney on art and its ties to, or modern art and its ties to the intelligence community and whatnot, and promoting this degeneracy with Duchamp signing his name onto toilets, and a few years ago, what was it, in Japan or China, some woman menstruating on canvas and calling that art, and it's fallen from any type of painting ability into just nonsense where, now you're just literally splashing paint up on a wall or menstrual blood or whatever the case may be and saying, look at this painting I did.
But we were led to believe that this was sort of a natural evolution, that we were just looking for the next step in creativity or something. And then you find out that this was foisted on us by the United States government. Actually was funding the CIA, and the CIA was spending millions and millions of dollars purposely promoting a degenerate position to prove to the rest of the world we were more free than they were.
Well, and, I have to 100% agree with you, because DCI William Colby even quotes Gloria Steinem in one of his letters as, showing that, and I've read this on the show before. Let me just pull up the database here and I'll read it. But showing that they wanted to show the United States as this open, free place, right? And it
Right.
wasn't about good art or open society. It was about promoting anything goes as so-called freedom. And this is off of the CIA's FOIA request website. I might quote Miss Gloria Stein. I'm one of those so assisted who commented that the CIA wanted to do what we wanted to do: present a healthy, diverse view of the United States. I never felt I was being dictated to at all, she said. And that's, of course, former Director of Central Intelligence William Colby quoting Steinem. And most of these feminists and modern artists, and Hans and I have shown the entirety of the 60s and 70s rock music culture, etc., was all manufactured to promote this degeneracy as freedom.
There's one of the books that I got, I think we talked about the books that deal with this, but one of them is called Madness and Modernism by Louis Sass, psychologist. But what he points out, and this is where it starts becoming interesting, is that they literally were leveraging schizophrenia as something people would be attracted to. And so he did this research on this and showing that, you look at some of the poetry and the rock lyrics in the 60s, you look at the modern art, and he started noticing a similarity between that art and that poetry and the thought patterns and the thinking processes in the creativity of schizophrenics. And so now you have to ask yourself, why is this something that's even leverageable at all? Why would people be attracted to schizophrenia? And I really don't have an answer to it.
I think, there's the freedom aspect of anything goes, because if you say that reality isn't real, then there's no truth or falsehood, and then you have moral relativism, and then you have all of this degenerate behavior that Christians would call the fall, right?
Right.
So by undermining reality, it creates a chain of events that they had to have been aware of, that, through the promotion of quantum physics and Plato's schizophrenia from, and Plato's Republic even starts off with the allegory of the cave, where they finally come out into reality. But, when you realize that the allegory of the cave is actually the image of, I hate to use reality, the image of life that they have promoted to the main population.
Not only that, but it's now some research is showing that the analogy of the cave actually were people that were purposely going into caves and using them as sensory deprivation chambers, which again is basically turning off reality and allowing your mind to invent reality.
Right. So for those of you who don't understand, we're talking about the primacy of consciousness, which is like the correct term. It's essentially the denial of reality, that everything in reality is a reflection of the self rather than you being of reality. And then
I would add to that before you finish,
okay.
But the church has kind of, not recently, but in the past, considered this monopsychism. So one half of the coin is that reality is a figment of your imagination. But the consequential thing of that is that, and this was figured out by Aquinas in a book, Against the Avarice, that's what this philosophy is. And it was called monopsychism, is that the consequence of this is, if reality isn't real, then the number of intellects in the world is numerically one. And so what happens, it's a philosophical logical consequence that if
because you're the only one in reality at that point, right?
Right. And so the only reason you could even think of anybody else's thoughts is because they're actually your thoughts.
Right.
And so the whole thing was attacked by the church, and this is what was condemned in the condemnation of 1277 and 1210, was what they called monopsychism. They thought it wasn't just that reality wasn't real, is that there was a schizophrenia about this, that reality was a projection of your mind.
Yeah.
And that your mind, anybody else's mind, would somehow merge into one mind at the end of time. And this was called monopsychism. And so it guaranteed your eternal existence. But in a way, it was an eternal hell because there was nothing constraining you from anything. Uh, yeah, I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Forbidden Planet.
Not sure if I have. I never remember movies I've watched.
It's a 1950s.
Except for Idiocracy and Hot Fuzz.
Well, Forbidden Planet is a science fiction movie from the 50s. If you haven't seen it, it's great. But the thing is, it's a reconstruction of Shakespeare, The Tempest. And it's really about monopsychic, what happens to somebody that can project reality from their mind. They don't create heaven, they create hell.
Yeah. Well, and I want to read some of Orfeo's comments. He's got some great comments here in the chat, and he says, actually, the art that truly rose in the period was illustration, starting with the pre-Raphaelites and ultimately leading to some real sophistication in graphic arts. And then I had mentioned Andy Warhol to him, and I've been talking with this guy who's recently written a book on Andy Warhol called Anti-Warhol, and he cites me in the book. But maybe I'll get him on in the coming weeks. But Orfeo continues on, if taste is destroyed, then morality is. They are a governing class. A governing class, can be made docile and malleable. Truth is known by beauty. Destroy that, no one has any inner guidance, which is completely true. And then he says, Homo sapiens means taste. Taste was seen as the defining element of our humanity. And then Oswald says, Joe Rogan thinks he's a Platonist with his sensory deprivation tanks. And just like using DMT to become enlightened, which is exactly correct, which is why I've exposed, psychedelics for the last decade as being, and the counterculture as being MK Ultra, and why I got so much crap for doing so, because so many are bought into all of that. But when you realize that the counterculture is the real MK Ultra, then you can start to get a grasp on what's going on. And in my article in Theogens, What's in a Name, throughout that article, I was circling the drain on that, but not quite getting that it was all about the promotion and normalization of schizophrenia. And you read that article recently, Steve, but, and it was like, they're talking about they're talking about marketing what they knew was schizophrenia or mimicking psychosis. They're marketing that as a religious experience. So all you have to do is seed that idea into people's heads, and then when they're having this schizophrenic experience, they think it's religious. Their mind is literally breaking apart. And then I had renamed the drugs suggestogens because of their capacity to create hypersuggestibility in the taker, so much so that if you've ever even heard the name psychedelic or entheogen or whatever, the outcome of your experience has already been impacted. If you've ever heard a Beatles song or whatever. And so because it's so heavily impacted through this hypersuggestibility, there's no real safe way to take these substances because of that factor. And if people are interested in that, go on the Logos Media website and read the Entheogens What's in a Name article, and it's like a 55-page article breaking down how they sold all of this, and you have Timothy Leary and Aldous Huxley bragging about this whole thing. And then Aldous Huxley worked with guys like Jiddu Krishnamurti, who were also promoting this whole primacy of consciousness, reality isn't real stuff. And then you take guys like Alan Watts, who took Gregory Bateson's double bind. And Gregory Bateson was a co-founder of the CIA, and he takes that into promoting, Eastern philosophy and meditation to get people caught into a double bind state where they would actually have sort of a psychotic reaction. And that's...
Go ahead.
No,
but the thing...
I was just going to say, but that's really, what is behind Alan Watts's work from the 60s, the so-called 60s hippie philosopher.
But we know, I mean, E. Michael Jones did, like I did this series of books on degeneracy and thing, and we all have been living in it. And we also know, especially from your work and things, that we knew that things, the Grateful Dead and different were being sponsored by the CIA. But you have to ask the question, what was their motive? And so the thing that actually sort of makes it one skeptical about that's true is in order to have a crime, you have to attach a motive to it. And I think my epiphany came when all of a sudden you realize the motive was freedom. The motive was somehow promoting the United States of this land of unmitigated freedom. And now once you attach a motive to it, you start seeing that there's also a propaganda angle to it, where you can start manipulating society and seducing them under the guise of freedom into something you probably wouldn't do normally.
Well, which is what the left is, they believe, so like Christian reality and morality and logos thinking through logic, through truth, through natural law is thrown out the window for reality is a reflection of my own mind, which is the most egoic thing ever. I am God. Everybody else, they don't have their own agency to do as they wish. They are all a reflection of me. And usually what happens in this hippie leftist philosophy is they'll get robbed or someone will get killed or whatever, and that's when the cognitive dissonance really strikes, because their normal response is, well, I need to be more positive, or and they're sitting there being positive all day long. Meanwhile, they're denying that others exist in this reality and have their own agency to act as they so choose, which as soon as you accept that fact, the weight of the world is lifted off of your shoulders. You're no longer the fault for the wars of the world and the murderers and the pedophiles and this kind of stuff. They all had their own agency to choose that behavior in reality. And then, so then this moral relativism begins to collapse and whatnot. But, Oswald in the chat asks if you, Steve, think that the modern obsession with panpsychism is a product of the New Age.
Yeah, I think that's the seductive part of it. Is I think almost, in fact, if you look at, I think almost all religion, you look at the degree that Platonism has infected the church. It's really, you know this. You read any book on the occult, and they're not hiding it. There's flat out, it's Hermeticism. That's the grounding thing to Hermeticism, to any Gnostic religion. The thing, moving the subject on a little bit, but what got me, and the other author and you can look these things, there's nice videos on YouTube. The other one is Frances Stoner Saunders.
Yep. I have her book behind me, The Cultural Cold War.
So I moved on from that to the question of if this is something that's marketable or mind controlling, or how far does this go back? Was this just something that was done in the 50s? One of the things that struck me in studying this is the proclaimed likeness. How should I say it? The schizophrenic who's really deep into schizophrenia is not somebody who has multi-personalities. The schizophrenic is somebody who has this cognitive dissonance between reality and mind. And so the only way they can deal with it is create two personalities. One for reality. You can even see this in the writings of David Hume. David Hume would go out and he'd live this scientific quasi-existence where there was no causality, anything. You couldn't even tell why billiard balls bounced off each other. But when he got up in the morning, he put his shoes on like anybody else, went and ate like everybody else. And you can sense the beginning of a schizophrenia.
It's a bizarre cognitive dissonance, right?
Right. But the question was, what the line that I stumbled across in studying this was the person who is there's a state where the multiple personality is wrestling. Which is the real self? Which self is me? Which one is the one that I'm going to assassinate in a sense, and which one's going to survive?
Well, and so this actually, Steve, ties directly into the whole leftist, hippie sort of Eastern philosophy idea of killing the ego, right?
Right.
Well, how do you have to have your ego to be able to feed yourself, to comb your hair, to put on your clothes, to take proper care of yourself, much less your family and children. So then, those who go down that path typically don't even have family and children.
Right. So keep that in your mind. You're wrestling with this idea when you're deep into schizophrenia. You're deciding which one is the authentic self, the one that's internal or the one that's external.
Is it Plato or is it Socrates?
Well, here we go. That's where I'm trying to go. The thing that struck me is that the person who's deep into the psychotic problem literally sees reality as a projection of their own mind. And so now I ask the question I started off with the show is, when you look at the advanced optical theories that were coming from the Church of the East, and you look at how advanced they really were in the 12th century and 13th century, how did we ever believe the fact that we were wrestling with a Platonic theory of light, which has no optics? They literally saw their eyeballs as generating reality from within. Was this not a sign of a schizophrenia?
Yeah. Well, and then going back, well, and you and I had discussed, I don't know if we discussed on the last show that we did with Kieran, or maybe you and I had discussed it on the phone together over the last few months, but the denial of reality in clinical terms is schizophrenia.
Right. And as exemplified by the art, throwing paint against the wall, making poetry of nonsense, inventing words that really don't mean anything. It's all of a kind. It's all of a piece. As you go back through these things, now you have to ask yourself, was Platonism always a form of schizophrenia? And this is where I think you and I both kind of had the epiphany, where I went back and I started looking at, because you take philosophy courses, you learn a scholarly version of Plato, and you're convinced this is one philosophy, Aristotle's the other philosophy. It's kind of a complete change of thought to think of that maybe Plato isn't a philosophy at all.
It's a schizophrenia. It's a
well, that's the paper I wrote that I sent to you. And here's my thinking on that. There's not that many writings about who Socrates really was. There's Socrates. What we know of Socrates is mainly through Plato, but there are other writings that display him, but the writings that the others display isn't quite what Plato envisions him to be. Socrates is more of really a critical theorist. He goes into he's more of a gruff, Ernest Hemingway kind of get in trouble kind of guy.
Double agent Hemingway. Sorry, I had to throw that in.
Well, and then he gets in trouble, and he's brought in trial because, number one, he's teaching his students about foreign gods. And he's also, the second thing is he's leading his students astray. And the main chronicler is one of his students, Plato. So, and you can, again, this is one of those things you can easily look up. The evidence, people like, I could read it, but it's no point in it. William James, if you are to believe the arguments and the records we have of Socrates, he was insane.
Yeah.
He would hear voices. He would follow what the voices would say. But the problem is that the Plato or the Socrates that we get from Plato and the Socrates that we get are not really quite the same. And so what you find up is what's called a Socratic problem. And the Socratic problem is, which is the real Plato and which is the real Socrates? Socrates' dialogues are usually conventionally divided up into 3 bits. You have the first bit, which he uses these dialogues as a, protagonist, antagonist type of thing. And so the first third of these dialogues, scholars are convinced that's the real Socrates. The middle third, Socrates starts becoming an idealist, which they say this is barely Socrates at all. But it's all of a sudden you can see that Plato is now forming this idea of idealism, that he's forming this idea of that, again, the primacy of consciousness type of thing.
Yeah.
Now you get the third set of dialogues. Socrates literally is a creation of Plato's own mind.
Yep.
And so now you have to start wondering,
well,
go ahead.
Oh, well, I wanted to cover some of these, and basically what you just said, Socrates is a creation of Plato's own mind. And Oswald says in the chat, I'm a schizophrenic and so am I, right? Which that's exactly what we're talking about, right? But Orfeo says, I'm just really seeing, just getting this now, you folks are really on it. So, it's really clicked in his head. And he says, Plato was very rhetorical. He gave a lot of lip service to Gnosticism, which you and I and Todd and I have exposed on the show before. That's exactly right. Gnosticism and Sufism, or Sophism, if you will, are behind promoting all of this stuff. In fact, Islam in the Sharia law books openly admits that it's a Gnostic religion as well. But his dialogue, Parmenides, should be read to make sense of what might have been his real position. And then Michael says the false spiritual concept that we are all one is essentially communistic. Well, exactly. That's what we're getting at here, essentially. And this is why, leftism and all of this stuff is so bought into all of this, and they can't see it. And also they're always so busy of accusing everybody else of exactly what they're doing. But that's really what's at the core of it. It's like the world is one. The whole world is me. The world is a reflection of myself. I'm God. Therefore, we should all be good communists.
Let me ask the final question, though. And this is where I think you and I both had the epiphany about the same time, is that now, and you can look this up, just do your own research on these. You can look this stuff up. Look at Socrates towards the end. He's pretty much become Plato, or a creation of Plato. And remember what we just talked about is what happens to the schizophrenic. At some point, he has to decide who's the real me, which is the real ego, and he has to contemplate which one's going to live and which ones he's going to assassinate or kill off. What prevents us from thinking that at this point in Socrates and Plato, that Socrates is just not Plato's alter ego, and the death of Socrates is literally Plato using drugs to kill off himself, to kill off his alter ego?
Wasn't it really to kill off reason too?
Yeah. So so the point
the death of reason. Sorry, Steve. The death of reason is the death of logos, which is why we see, these attacks on Christianity so much, because Christianity, and we're talking pre-Vatican II, insists that reality is real and that truth is God. And if we can call those who believe in reality fascists, and then, those crazy Christians, those crazy right-wingers, they think boys are boys and girls are girls. How dare they? If I put on my underoos and think I'm Superman or Batman, by golly, I am Superman or Batman, and I'm going to pass laws to force you to believe in my psychosis. Where when we were kids, at 5 o'clock, it was dinner time. We took the underoos off when we were back to being ourselves again.
Right. So the thing is, the question is, the ultimate question is, considering Plato, I believe, was at most war with Heraclitus, who was the first person who formulated the idea of logos. Have we been following or treating a mental disease as a legitimate philosophy for thousands of years.
It would have to be that, right?
I would think it would have to be. And just looking at Plato's own writings. And it's amazed me, and I think you were amazed when I came up with this. I thought it was like a slap across the face. My God, if we've been giving this legitimacy by even treating it as a philosophy.
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, that's just the thing. But it goes way back. Well, I've been exposing primacy of consciousness on the show for 6-7 years or more, and I wrote that article in Theogen's What's in a Name back in 2014, and still looking at this and not just seeing it as, oh my God, they are, I saw them as promoting the hypersuggestibility, and I saw that they knew that it was psychosis and schizophrenia, but it didn't click that the whole thing is about normalizing schizophrenia to the whole of society, where they literally, deny reality on every level, such as boys being boys, girls being girls. Your doctor assigns your gender at birth. You're not, born with 6,000 different components between men and women that are decided by our DNA, long before we're ever born.
But don't you think, whether this is a major discovery or not, but don't you think we've moved the bar here? That the burden of proof now is prove to me that this is a legitimate philosophy, considering all the data, considering all the fact that you're interjecting if we take Plato as being legitimate, what's this ancient theory doing in a place where we have
here's the thing though, but you're talking about reason, logos, logic, and you cannot have a reasonable logic-based conversation with someone who's caught up in primacy of consciousness and thinks that they're God, and the very conversation you're trying to have with them is a reflection of themselves. So right. It's they're caught in a circular.
So what did we really discover here? I mean, I feel like we've discovered something, and I feel that maybe if only our approach has been wrong. Are we giving it legitimacy when it really doesn't? Is this the way you would train a dog? Is this a compassion you would treat somebody who is actually schizophrenic? Would you argue with them? Is our approach even right?
Well, that's a good question. And Oswald says, are you sure that normalizing schizophrenia hasn't already morphed into schizophilia? And it has. He's right.
Yeah.
The left is fully in love with schizophrenia. They accuse everybody else of what they're doing. Up is down, left is right. Right is wrong, etc.
As a philosophy or a tool of manipulation.
Does it have to be an either or?
No, not necessarily. In a way, because you see so many liberals hypocritically proclaim masks, proclaim everybody's got to do these things, but then you look behind the scenes, they aren't following their own rules. So to what degree are they actually believing it? Or are they still caught in this schizophrenic thing where under certain circumstances they have one morality, on the other circumstance they have another morality? Does it shift? Are we dealing with multiple personalities?
Could you elaborate a little bit more on what is monopsychism? Because with what you were saying earlier, it seemed to me that what you're saying, I mean, I know you said the aspect of promoting freedom, like schizophrenia promoting.
Well, it's freedom. Literally primacy of consciousness. Monopsychism is that your mind is the only one that exists in the universe.
Oh, so it's just the same thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or if there were potentially multiple intelligences, that they were actually the illusions of the same mind thinking, branches of the same mind somehow. And it, again, going back to the other, and I'm not pretending to have the answers here. I'm just asking the question. I think they're pretty obvious questions. We're led to believe that modernism is a natural evolution of society, yet it has all this degeneracy handed to it. that it attaches itself to. Why are we to believe this is an evolution of society when it's really shown to be by, again, these scholars we just cited, as being a tool of propaganda, a tool of manipulation?
And here we are. And we
Here we
can
are.
see that, I spent a decade exposing the CIA's MK Ultra program is exactly that.
But I think what we're doing is we're attaching a motive to it. In order to have a real,
well, sure.
we have
Now we have the why.
We have another dimension here,
right? And not a quantum.
Yeah, right. Right. So, you're going to have me back in a couple weeks, and I would like to continue this discussion further. But what one of my past discussions with you was about the Dead Sea Scrolls. And one of the questions I keep getting asked is why would they do such a thing? And just to prime the pump a little bit, my present research is into the Codex Sinaiticus and what's the legitimacy of that and how that fits into this big picture.
And how that all connects into primacy of consciousness, undermining the Christian church, showing that, all of this leading to Vatican II so that they can promote this Gnostic view of Christianity and moral relativism and all of this stuff that the left has promoted. And, it all falls back to what was likely the very first act of the CIA after their founding in June 1947, 3 days after they were founded, as you and I discussed in that episode several months ago, was that they created the Dead Sea Scrolls so that they could undermine Christianity and play all of this. Kitchen just arrived. Hey, Kitchen, good to have you. Sorry you're late. But, it's...
Interestingly enough, I thought I wouldn't find much data on this in the books, because what's odd about this, and you have all these earth-shaking things that are supposed to be so important, but then you look for scholarly books on, they're non-existent. You start wondering, how scholarly is this if it's... But I have found some books on
if it's been peer-reviewed, it's got to be legit, because Thomas Henry Huxley had no agenda for creating the peer review system to maintain the status quo. Oh,
right.
Maybe he did. Sorry.
But I'm amazed at the stuff I've actually found. So it's looking up. I think we can have a similar discussion next time.
Kieran, you've hardly spoken up in this episode.
I know, you guys were just going back and forth. You had a good rhythm going on. I did I don't know if it's maybe too much or I just missed something, but when you were talking in the beginning, you were saying that Plato had like a primitive view of optics.
Yeah.
But then later on, I guess I'm not maybe wrapping my mind around that, because the first thing I thought when you said that is it's like, did Plato view optics the same as Goethe? But then you were saying later that it was like, with him promoting primacy of consciousness, it's not even like he's really recognizing reality. So how could you recognize optics as like a legitimate thing?
Well, his theory was there was no optics. Plato's
Right.
theory is there was no optics. It was just reality. Reality was a projection of the mind. My question was, with all the sophistication, what Goethe did is he questioned Newton's. You can do this. Puzzled me even as a little kid. I would have science kits and things like that, and you set up Newton's prisms, and you expect to see these rainbows and stuff like that. And you set them up, and you realize the experiments don't work. You never get the rainbows supposedly that you're supposed to get. And then you realize that what makes the thing work is not the light that's shining in the prism. It has to shine through a slit. If you shine the light through a slit, all of a sudden you start seeing rainbows and all that other kind of stuff. Goethe went in and said, well, how do we know it's the prism making the colors and it's not the slit? If the slit is crucial to the production of the colors, how do we know which is the real thing? So Goethe started looking at colors in terms of boundaries. I got a book here I can quick show you. This is a book on Goethe, but Goethe in his thing would see that where boundaries would form, you would get blue and cyan, or on the bottom you would get red and yellow. And Goethe insisted that the green was something that was made up, and it happened when you got the blue and yellow mixed together, and you would get this green in between. But he contested whether this was actually a product of the prism or the slit. And when you start looking at it, this is a bit more sophisticated theory of light that even physicists are looking at now, is wondering if this is maybe some way of wrapping Newton and Goethe together. But when Newton looked at it, or when Goethe looked at this, he looked back into the physics of Robert Grosseteste and these early Christian Western scientists, Christians, academia, scholars. They found out that the earliest theory of light was Goethe's theory of light. That's what had been passed on by the Church of the East. And so, and not that these decisions are in stone or something, but we've been exposed for more than a millennia of fairly sophisticated theories of light. Why would anybody in the West give any lip service at all to Plato's theory of light? We're taught that before these discoveries came to the West, everybody thought in terms of Plato's theory of light. Well, if it's a schizophrenic theory of light, why would we think that anybody thought that way at all? Mm-hmm. Maybe they didn't understand light, but I don't think it's common sense that reality is a projection of somebody's mind. I don't think that's it. Why is that even a default setting?
Okay, a few questions here in the chat. First off, Saramer is saying that because you said that the Gospel of John was likely a play, he thinks that the Gospel of John is a fake. That's not what we discussed.
No.
And then...
No, that the Gospel of John, there's some evidence to say that what happened is that John was very old. He was probably about 100 years old. And I believe it's Papias was his biographer, or, that's who even Mark was written. Peter basically dictated Mark's gospel to him. So that's really Peter's gospel. John, some scholars believe, and I think it's actually credible, because if you look, the Jewish version of this would have been the Purim feast, where you
Book of Esther.
Yeah, you had a play performed every feast of Purim. That it was a church type play, which is exactly what the church does now on Good Friday. Main Catholic Church, Anglican churches, Orthodox churches have a Good Friday play. And so a lot of these things, look at the book of John, they realize a lot of this would have been, kind of takes the form of a play based on Euripides. And there's even church records that kind of admit to that in the 11th, 12th century. Eventually they had to tone it down because it was getting kind of gruesome. But it's well known that it either was a play to start with, or it turned into a play as time goes on, which is it is to this day. But that doesn't mean that it's inauthentic or it's fake. It just means you got a culture, not everybody had access. There was no printing presses. Somehow you carry a legend on, and one way you do that is as a play, or right, as poetry or songs, or
Right. So
are you talking about Euripides Bacchae? Is that the play you're talking about?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So, there's several church records or scholars that kind of acknowledge that if it was a play, it was written is modeled after the Bacchae, because the Bacchae literally is a play about the primacy of reason over faith, which is the horse and the rider thing. And so if that's the case, then you have to look at the Pharisees as being the Bacchae, and the ones that are hypocritical. They're looking at emotions and stuff as guiding things. And then the Christianity and Christ himself was more the it was the represented reason and belief, which would be logos. And the book of John literally begins, in the beginning was the logos.
Yep. Which is what I responded to him in the chat there.
Right.
So Oswald asks if you have asked your opinion of psychiatry versus anti-psychiatry.
I just had this discussion with my wife before we went on. I think there's legitimate reasons for some psychology. People have nervous disorders. People have addictive things going on, but I think a lot of psychology is better explained by game theory.
Well, and I think a lot of psychology, as so many psychologists dismiss Christianity, but I think if people grasped and followed as closely as possible Christian logos, there would be a lot less need for psychology and psychiatry.
Right.
And
well, a lot of this would have to do, again, and maybe it would be another episode, but it would have to go into the true meaning of these words that in the Greek and what they were used in the Bible. We see them in the Bible in terms of faith and belief. But if you actually go back to the Greek, belief had to do with reason and faith had to do with emotional. You look at, you're supposed to have good faith, but it really, if it specifically says it's belief that saves you. And so they're not really the same thing. In the Greek, the belief is like the rider of the horse. He orchestrates the faith. He tells which is legitimate, which isn't. If you read Christian scholasticism, what they will call, what Jan just called cognitive dissonance, they would call the egocentric predicament. And the egocentric predicament is, how do I know? They called it, what was outside me, the veil of tears, in that somewhere I've got to take reality. Some of it's true, some of it's fake. How do I know that a movie is a movie and not reality? How do I know reality is reality? So somewhere there's a decision process in the mind that can discern what's real and what's not. And that really, again, that has to do, I would say, with original sin. In the ancient writings, that original sin would have to do with losing that ability to discern.
Right. I had this conversation with somebody last night that it was all about discernment.
Yeah.
And then that goes again into agency, free agency.
Right.
Cymatic says, I think it's also relevant to point out that tech and social media are only exacerbating this situation, as one can choose who to be depending on the profile or platform. Yeah, it is, and that's why I've put out the Trivium method for 12 going on 13 years now, so that people can learn to think for themselves and not rely on me. It's like, when people write me and ask me my opinion on something, it's like, well, what do you think? And have you looked at who, what, where, when, why, and how? And I try to lead them to look at the grammar, logic, and rhetoric for themselves.
The thing is that you have at least I have the question, is that if you're going to study logos, you have to dedicate yourself. You've got to really make a commitment. And then you look at modern society and you see all this Platonism, or what we call Neoplatonism or Gnosticism. Is that something people study? Or is a lot of people, how do they absorb it somehow? Is it?
Yeah, it's like pseudo. It's like pseudo Platonism or pseudo Gnosticism. It's just they're so overwhelmed by it through TV and society as a whole that they get implanted with this Gnostic, anti-reality, sort of mystic philosophy.
Are they really thinking about this? Are they really studying it? Or are they just literally taking the path of least resistance? And that path of least resistance has been supplied to us by
I would agree with the latter, and I think the former are the psychopaths who probably know that they're promoting this stuff.
Right.
That's my take on it. Because
wish I could.
if the elites like Aldous Huxley and Jiddu Krishnamurti and all the psychopaths at the CIA, the Tim Learys and Terrence McKenna's and all of these people, they knew that they were promoting this stuff onto society as an agenda for the CIA, as MK Ultra, as mind control ultra, MK Ultra. So they had to have known that they were selling. I mean, I've sent you that quote of Aldous Huxley and Timothy Leary bragging that they were creating the fall.
Right.
So
Well,
what does that
the
say?
thing is, the thing is we pick up the Bible, we pick up Genesis, we start looking at these things as, Aesop's fables or mythologies or something like that. And we don't realize that deep within this, it is a lesson in this whole thing of reality.
Yeah, exactly.
And you look at when this knowledge came to the West after, the West was kind of in disaster. They had even taken Rome and moved it to Constantinople. One evidence that of all this is look at the Romance languages, French and Spanish, Italian. They're all degenerate in a sense versions of Latin. So when Rome picked up, these countries were left on their own devices and their languages evolved on separate paths. But when the Renaissance starts, these things start coming back in the form of what they started creating in form of scholasticism. And there's several books you can go out and realize that this scholasticism was taught and promoted in ancient Nisibis, which was a Christian university. Again, in Edessa, which was actually the repository of all the Christian relics originally. And so now you look at, pick up some decent books on scholasticism, and not the modern ones aren't any good because they're trying to repaint it as something, as a new age apology. But the original books, there's several of them out there. Cardinal Mercier, they're kind of hard to get. I think I sent you one. There's a good book, a nun published on the Trivium itself. And you look at,
I have it right up there.
Yeah,
Sister Miriam Joseph.
You look at scholasticism. Well, why did, when all this stuff came at the beginning of the Renaissance, you see this booming Roger Bacon? You read Roger Bacon, he's discovering stuff that we now accredit to Einstein. You have this tremendous learning that's going on in the form of scholasticism. The whole university system becomes invented at that time. All civilization starts blooming and prospering. They start making discoveries. They solve all these world problems, all because of logos. And now we're trying to turn the clock backwards and destroy what we built.
Well, because like Terrence McKenna said, they're trying to bring in a new dark age,
Yeah, I would agree.
And I think that becomes obvious when you see this. I mean, all of this stuff is why I parted from the Gnostic label three going on 4 years ago now, because I realized it was all BS and had to get away from it. So, there are lots of comments in the thing just going on about the show here, but I don't see any questions. I think that's probably a good spot to wrap it up. What do you think, Steve?
I would leave it with the same question that I asked us a few minutes ago. Prove to me how would you know one from the other? Prove to me that what we call Platonism and Neoplatonism is a legitimate philosophy.
Right.
How do we know that it wasn't always a dressed up, sophisticated version of schizophrenia?
Which, to sum it all up in one word, really, all of this normalization of schizophrenia and this whole fall in moral relativism and the rest of it can be summed up in one word: Satanism.
Yeah. Well, and again, does this realization give us a new tool? Does it make us see something a bit more objectively? Does it give us a little bit more of an edge than we had before? I feel like it does. I feel like looking at this through that lens gives me a little bit saner view of all this stuff. I don't think it pays for us to argue with somebody who's maybe our approach is wrong. Maybe we need to re-examine how we approach the Gnostic. We don't argue with them. Maybe we realize what they are and who they are.
Because as soon as you engage a schizophrenic, are you becoming a schizophrenic, even trying to engage in these people because they can't recognize logos?
Yeah.
Or do we just dismiss them as primacy of consciousness, figments of our imagination?
There you go.
So I think that's a good spot to wrap it up. If there are any quick questions, I'll give people a couple seconds to post them up. Otherwise, we're going to wrap it up here. Kieran, do you have anything else to add?
I don't really think so.
Did it
All
make
right.
sense?
Yeah, I did. I guess I don't want to make it too long-winded. The only thing that I was thinking at the very end is where me and you had a private conversation, Steve, where you were talking about the tree of porphyry and how basically I was looking at it with kind of the monologue that you just had, where it was like the teaching of scholastic philosophy and the tree of porphyry that helped you, or that helped people back then to kind of understand how the mind worked. And so with like what Jan was saying, where it's like if people understood logos or that was promoted more, then we wouldn't need disciplines like psychiatry so much, because back then it was more understood like how your mind works, and that would help you to order your mind, to see your place in the world, to understand like your spatial temporal place in reality, and not just want to basically withdraw within yourself.
I think you're exactly right. And I think that's exactly why one of the big questions I had when I was learning scholasticism was, why is this in the Bible? If I was going to look for this in the Bible, where would I find it? And I reduced scholasticism down to the main, because they didn't have books at this point in time. You didn't have books in the sense that we have now. If you did, you wrote them, you copied them. But what they did have is charts and mnemonic diagrams and stuff like that. So the main mnemonic diagram of Aristotle was the tree of porphyry. And then I looked at Genesis and realized that it's a perfect, you can lay the days of creation right on top of the tree of porphyry and you get the same tree. And so I started looking at Genesis like we did tonight, as it's got multiple, you can look at it as a story about a man and a woman. You can look at it as a teaching diagram. You can look at it as like the beginning of Genesis, like I said tonight, was actually a fairly sophisticated understanding of creation. That light does have a critical, light plays into this as not just something of knowledge itself, but that light can become matter and matter can become light and energy. I mean, those are pretty sophisticated thoughts.
Yeah.
And you look at, there are physicists, they even have their little YouTube things where they've come to Christianity. They realize that Genesis actually is much more sophisticated than we give it credit for. It's
and the Big Bang. Yeah, a lot of physicists over the last 4 or 5 years suddenly became Christian, didn't they?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's why and you can see, and that's why I tried to, maybe I didn't do the greatest job, but that's why I began the talk with that, in that if you can see things like that, you can see why that type of thing is transformative. And they literally believe, and I have several books I found this, that learning the tree of porphyry and why it works and why it's important actually can have therapeutic value to people.
Yeah.
Oswald asks if you see any correlation between IQ and schizophrenia. I don't personally, but
some people have. I don't.
Yeah. All right. I think that's a good place to wrap it up. Ladies and gentlemen, like and subscribe. Please support the show, logosmedia.com. You can PayPal at contact@logosmedia, or Cash App, $sign at Logos Media, something like that. Appreciate all the support. We'll be back hopefully next week. We'll have Dr. Hans Utterback for his 50th time. And he and I have been talking about doing another show for several weeks now. And again, thanks everybody. Happy New Year, Merry Christmas, all of that stuff. Sorry we missed you last week with the roads and the tree falling on the house and all of that not so fun stuff. So anyway, everybody take care and good night.
Good night, everybody.